A little while ago, you and I had the pleasure of driving a little Fiat Uno, and within that video I mentioned that Fiat once built some of the best small family cars in the world. Cars like the 500 are always mentioned, but it all really started turning golden at the end of the 1960s when they brought us the 128 and 127, the latter of which helped create the super mini market as a whole. But today we're fast forwarding to 1985, where that thinking and all the success leads us to see a confident Fiat. A Fiat that was changing, and a Fiat that was doing things that bit differently to the competition. Fiat have always been a bit of an enigma to me, because ignoring stupid British perceptions of Italian cars, they've gone through a number of incredibly different eras when it comes to philosophy and marketing. In the current age, for example, they sell mainly on style, whereas 20 odd years ago they sold on economy, and 40 years ago was right here, where Fiat had some of the most technologically advanced production facilities in Europe, somewhat forced upon them by the politics of the 1970s, but very impressive nonetheless. Fiat's commitment to excellence over the years has produced highly popular and much loved cars such as the Topolino, the 509, the 500, not to mention the hatchback that started it all, the 127. Much imitated, frankly never surpassed. In 1975, the development of the Fiat Robogate system enabled cars to be built with unerring accuracy. In 1983, Car magazine heralded the Fiat Uno as quite simply the best small car yet, and in 1984 the Uno was awarded the coveted Car of the Year accolade. The research and design facilities have helped Fiat to develop into the largest, best known and most influential car manufacturer in the world. At Fiat's research centre, engines, brakes and transmissions are tested under strenuous track driving conditions, which enable Fiat to continually improve the all-round performance of its entire range of cars. There is also the company's parts complex in Turin, which feeds more than 12,000 service centres around the world. The tangible benefits are there for all to see. Fiat can call on the pick of the world's car designers, Giugiaro to shape the Panda and Uno, Bertone to sculpt the mid-engined X1-9. Vast resources can build the most technologically advanced production lines in the world. For example, 99% of the welding points on the Uno are formed automatically. Many of the components are put together off the main assembly line, so each can be individually inspected and tested. And no car body leaves our factory without the protection provided by our fully automated 25-stage anti-perforation paint program. The result is some of the most technologically advanced production models on the road today. Naturally, all the cars in the range offer space, comfort and practicality, and in the true Fiat tradition, economy, power and performance. Not to mention a 12-month unlimited mileage warranty, with a free recovery service should you break down, and a 6-year anti-perforation warranty. If we sift through the usual marketing gubbins there, I hope it gave you some perspective as to how big and how important Fiat were at this time. Despite the politics of the years before, they were one of the most stable car makers in the world, with one of the best market penetrations in the world, and were still growing. By this point they had control of Lancia and a stake in Ferrari, but the following year they'd buy Alfa Romeo, all on the road to becoming the ridiculous beast that Stellantis is today. It would also be fair to say that Fiat were at least one of the most influential car makers in the world, pushing Volkswagen, Ford and General Motors into producing cars in the pattern we've come to expect today. So on to the Fiat Panda, which grew, in Italy at least, to be one of the most important cars ever produced. While the preceding Fiat 126 stayed on alongside it, the Panda was designed to bring the front drive revolution to Fiat's smallest line of cars. But rather than be a normal and rather bland economy car, it was designed to be ruthlessly and endlessly efficient. Giugiaro designed this shape to be as economical to produce as humanly possible, being remarked on by the man himself as the automotive equivalent of a pair of jeans. Even the glass is all perfectly flat in order to pinch as many pennies as possible. Not only did this mean the Panda was brimming with character, but it became a cultural icon. They produced it for 23 years, and even 21 years on from that, Italy is still crawling with these things. But speaking of crawling, that's a Panda 4x4, a car that didn't really need to exist, but when it happened, it made perfect sense. If the standard car was so rugged, then it suited the added ability of the exceptionally simple Steyr-engineered four-wheel drive system. If the front-drive Panda was the automotive equivalent of a pair of jeans, then the 4x4 was the automotive equivalent of a mountain goat. While being small limits the size of what it can conquer, the same factor means it can sneak into places. I'm utterly convinced that this little car is the greatest go-anywhere vehicle ever produced, and I don't think that's controversial to say. But back to the normal Pandas we have over here, and early cars had this simple metal grille, the slats of which shifted from side to side depending on whether it was air-cooled or water-cooled. Higher spec cars and all later ones had this plastic grille of the 4x4, but either way, I adore the simplicity. Among the likes of the 2CV, the Mini and the Renault 4, the Panda is unapologetically a car and nothing else. That didn't play spectacularly well in Britain, partly because we don't have taste, but also because the 1980s were appallingly image-centric, and because the Panda was austere, it just didn't appeal. As ever, the Italians and French knew better, but hey-ho. I love the simplicity, even to the point where the seats are unrecognisable compared to any other European car launched as late as 1980. Now, dashboards with a pod system were popular, but none as completely as the Pandas, where the rest of the dash is simply carpeted over. And what other cars are there where it's considered acceptable to just remove the rear seats for the sake of some more storage? For Fiat at least, Fiat's mainstream appeal began with the Uno. As I mentioned earlier, we've explored the Uno in some depth, so I'll put a card up in the corner. But as we heard from the first page, the Uno was quite widely considered to be the best small car in the world. The Peugeot 205 was very much a contemporary, but while it may be the driver's choice, the Uno was a more practical and more efficient car, because as with the Panda, Fiat just do that ever so well. Therefore, at the Uno and 205's launch in 1983, the Fiat is generally considered to have come out on top. Even in retrospect as well, while the 205 is deified, the Uno sold in vast numbers all over the world. But back here in 1985, we see a pre-facelift Uno, even with its original Dante Giacosa overhead valve engine in the Uno 45 and the spectacular Lampredi overhead cam engine in the Uno 70. But even at this early stage, Fiat were confident in the reception the Uno had received. Not only because it carried on the reputation and character of the 127, but because it built a modernity all of its own. We'll flesh that point out in its entirety a little bit later, as it will matter, but for now, the pre-facelift Uno's interior is appreciably different to the rather conventional one we saw in the facelift car I road tested. Just to hop back for a quick second, the Uno's exterior looks to us, viewing it in 1983, as very conventional and even rather plain. To be fair, it was plain even in 1983, but it's still a nice little box. The point, however, is the modernity. Now, that's not the modernity I said we would mention later. This is a different modernity. I know I'm being confusing now, but go with it. In 1983, almost every Super Mini had visible metal valances, rubber-sealed windscreens and chunky rain gutters. They were built in the same manner as cars from the 50s, but Giugiaro decided to make the Uno a streamliner. So hot off the heels of the Audi 100 and Ford Sierra, the Uno had a tiny drag coefficient and would still have looked acceptable 15 odd years later. They're really small touches, but put one of these alongside an Austin Metro, a car which in 1983 had only been on the market for 2.5 years, and they look as though they're from different centuries. The neatness and streamlining is really powerful in making the Uno appear as a step up, a second generation for the Super Mini genre. But back to the interior, and that modernity is reflected. Taking the idea of fingertip controls from Citroën and designing an instrument pod that brings all the controls to your fingertips but doesn't look like one of those twisty-turny things from a children's playground. This, again, is something other manufacturers would emulate over the coming years, namely the Mark II Metro and Mark II Fiesta. It does seem strange then how Fiat got rid of all this for the Uno's facelift. I can see why the newer car's interior looked more attractive and was better assembled, but it was less practical, and I don't think that's a positive move. Either way, Fiat and Giugiaro did a good job back in '83, and with such a great level of practicality allied to proper seats and trim, you can see why, for Britain at least, the Uno was that much more popular than the little Panda. The Fiat Strada is where things start to become a little bit murky. Not because there was anything wrong with them, but because the Uno was a huge success for Fiat in the UK, but the Strada never quite managed to gain a foothold. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. But first, let's go back to that modernity point. Because in the rest of Europe, this car was called the Fiat Ritmo, and the Ritmo felt like a fresh start for Turin. I've already mentioned the politics of the 1970s, and with that context, it's astonishing they managed to build as many cars as they did in that decade. The plight of companies like Fiat is conveniently forgotten in the UK when anyone brings up British Leyland and says that industrial relations killed them. Total rubbish. But come 1978, Fiat had invested a huge amount of money into the Robogate system mentioned on the first page. The Ritmo, Strada, whatever, was the first car to benefit from this new robotised construction, and besides less stoppages, promised much finer tolerances than before, hoping to improve the perception of Fiat's quality control. In the UK, and I'm sure in other territories, Fiat ran a television ad campaign about Robogate, proclaiming that the Strada was hand-built by robots. Naturally, this earned itself a British Leyland-themed parody, hand-built by robots, which was ironic as the Austin Metro was being built by an even more sophisticated system by the time that aired, but I digress. The point I'm making is that the Strada was the beginning of a bit of a turnaround in the perception of Fiat in the UK. Because while it didn't sell all that brilliantly, it paved the way for the Uno and later the Punto in 1993. But back to the Strada, and I'd wager that a part of why it wasn't popular was because of its styling. In 1978, Britain was in a love affair with rear-drive, leaf-sprung Fords. So bring us a Fiat with some of the goofiest styling you've ever seen and, yeah, I adore the first series of Strada because its styling is so mad. But come 1982, and they facelifted the car with the new corporate Fiat grille, which made the car a bit of a hybrid between conservative and mad circular door handles, etc. The third series Strada from 1986 would really make it conservative before it was replaced by the very Uno-esque Tipo in 1988. That car was quite successful in the UK, and you can see the Strada's relative unpopularity coming through by the fact that this should have been Fiat's most important car in the UK. This was the family car market, and while the Panda and Uno had 2 full pages, this only had 1. This is where things begin to show the future of Fiat though, because while I did say that the Strada didn't sell in huge numbers, they were still respectable enough, just not up to the levels Fiat might have expected, and certainly not to the levels of the Uno. But 1985 was the changeover year between 2 of Fiat's big family saloons, the rear-drive Argenta and the front-drive Croma. Now, the Argenta was fundamentally a very old car by the end of production, but it sold in minuscule numbers in the UK, so Fiat ignored it. There is no Argenta or Croma available in the UK in 1985, so the Fiat Regata is the top-of-the-range family car that Fiat was offering. And while on paper these weren't particularly special, the context is quite interesting. You see, this is a restyled and lengthened Fiat Strada, complete with a saloon car rear end. Traditionally, this would have simply been badged as a Strada saloon, but in the 1980s, saloon cars had become a conservative upmarket style, having been made way for in many manufacturers' ranges by fastback hatchbacks. We're thinking Ford Sierra, the Croma of course, and many others. As a result, the smaller Ford Escort was made posher, made a saloon, and became the Ford Orion. Fiat were doing a very similar thing here by giving us the Regata, and in fact, the Orion and Regata launched at virtually exactly the same time in September 1983. What makes this even more interesting is the fact that the Regata was noticeably stylistically different to the Strada on which it was based, and these door handles would preview those found on the final facelift Strada 3 years later. Now that's all rather nerdy, but the headline is that the Regata was designed to be conservative and appeal to those either downsizing from a larger saloon or those who thought a hatchback was a little bit too radical. And that's all reflected in the way it's marketed up here. While the Strada's copies surrounded the ideas of practicality, engineering modernity and performance in the Abarth, the Regatas flirted with it being lavish, smooth and luxurious. And while there wasn't a fire-breathing Abarth, the engines were that bit more powerful than the Stradas, fitting in with that upmarket appeal. This is 1985, however, and while the Strada was now a 7-year-old car and had been relegated to having only one page, the Regata was still relatively new, so is afforded the privilege of a full spread. Now, we all know that the Regata is a car almost lost to history on these fair isles, but this presents a little sliver of aspiration in Fiat's mid-size cars that we just don't see today. So that rather marks the end of the mainstream Fiat range in the UK, because we're now presented by the Fiat X19, a car that wasn't really a Fiat anymore. You see, the X19 was based on the old Fiat 128, with a mid-mounted engine, rear-wheel drive and a spectacular Marcello Gandini shape. But it was launched back in 1972, and by 1982, Fiat weren't fussed anymore. They handed full production over to Bertone, who had always built the bodies, and washed their hands of it. The cars carried Bertone badging and were sold by Bertone, but in different markets, the Bertone X19 was still being sold by Fiat importers, so it had always maintained its place in the UK Fiat range. However, this was 1985. For a few years, the X19 virtually had the sports car market to itself after MG and Triumph shut up shop, but 1984 was the year the Toyota MR2 debuted. The MR2 was based directly on the philosophy and styling of the X19, so when placed together, the Fiat looked like a bit of a relic now. Toyota were only growing in prominence in the UK, and with that, this car does look a bit lost. With its facelift a few years earlier, it had lost the litheness of the original thanks to the huge new bumpers, and the interior was quirky, but of poor quality. As a result, they began trying to liven it up with things like the VS we see here, resplendent in its grey and silver two-tone. The X19 is one of my absolute favourite cars. I won't stop going on about how much fun I had in the one I drove for Twin Cam, but the 80s ones just don't do it for me. And given the choice in period, I'd have bought an MR2. The selling points are all the same as they were back in the 70s, but time had passed, and the X19 just looked old, I'm afraid. And speaking of old, shoved right at the back of the brochure is a baby. If the Panda wasn't a huge player in the UK, then the 126 was on a different planet. Very much an ultra-economy car with its mechanicals dating back to 1957. But over in Poland, the 126 was in its pomp as the Maluk. So if the car was still doing brilliantly in some markets, then Fiat might as well have kept bringing it to the UK in spite of its obviously niche status here. After all, they don't take up much space on the boats, and Fiat could bring the 126 to compete against the Eastern Bloc bargains that were all the rage in this period. The 126 may not be as pretty as the old 500, but I don't know, it's somehow cuter to me with its sad face and surprisingly timeless styling. I don't understand how it manages to do that, but simplicity is beauty. Weirdly, however, the seats on offer in this particular car look more appealing than the 2CV style frames with fabric draped over them we saw in the Panda. But anyway, the 126 paints a curious picture, because while cars from this era were of course built in Poland, it was really the end of an era. The the last mass-produced air-cooled rear-engine car from the era in which that was popular. At one point in time, before the 128, Fiat were all in on rear-engine cars, so this is a little slice of heritage still sticking out of the Fiat range, especially as it debuted in the same year as the X1 1972. Now, I don't know how much one of these cost in the UK in 1985, but I can't imagine it was all that much cheaper than the objectively better Panda. So it'll be interesting to see the UK sales figures for these little toddlers. But with that, we have all the standard aftercare stuff, and that is Fiat in 1985. This was a strange period where different niches and different eras were all colliding, as Fiat were experimenting with ways of keeping their smaller cars on top of the world, and in places like the UK, keeping their larger cars afloat. The 1990s would see a similar thing happening, though with less collision in terms of eras, but this is really the beginning of a realisation that Fiat, as we always knew, were making some of the best small cars in the world, but in many markets, that's where their profits lay. The following year, 1986, would see them buy Alfa Romeo from the Italian government, allowing them to somewhat ease their chase for a truly international, successful big saloon, and allow cars like the Alfa 155 and 164 to take on that mantle. But with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description and get access to this and many other brochures for your viewing pleasure, and I'll have more videos coming along soon.